At IAIA, I teach in the creative writing program, and I primarily teach fiction, although I've also taught creative nonfiction. And I teach journalism and Native American literature as well. So in the process of doing all that, that has given me the privilege of intersecting with Simon. I met Simon many years ago, back in the late 70s, and this was when I was a journalist with the Pueblo News, and I interviewed him during that time period. And since then, I have come to know him during the readings. He's a frequent visitor at IAIA, and he has actually contributed much to our program. So over the years, I have come to know him well. And I just feel very honored and privileged to have had the opportunity to co-edit this book with Susan Berry Brill de Rimedes. Susan and I attended the graduate program here at the University of New Mexico back in the, I think this was like the mid to the late 80s. She was in the lit program, and I was in the creative writing program. And so that's how we came to know one another. This particular volume grew out of a special issue from the Studies in American Indian Literatures volume that came out, I believe it was in 2004. And Susan edited that special issue, and it focused entirely on Simon and included creative pieces. I was a contributor to that. And it also included some literary criticism. So when she had done that particular project, she thought that, you know, there was a lot there and there was more to be, you know, mined in this area. So she asked me if I'd be interested in collaborating with her on the project. And I thought, great, you know, I know Simon, I know his work, and I would be happy to do it. And of course, when we started out this project, you know, I thought, oh, it's not going to be too hard to, you know, edit a collection of essays. You know, I'll read a few essays and make some remarks or whatever, and that'll be it. But it turns out that this project was 3 years in the making, and it grew and it grew in scope. It grew in the number of contributors, and it also grew in the different categories that we included. The book basically is separated into 4 categories, and there's one, the introductory section, which includes both an introduction by myself and by Susan, and then an overview of the entire book. Section 2 includes interviews of Simon, and one was by David Dunaway, who was to join us today, and as many of you might know, David Dunaway is a professor in the English department here at UNM, and he had done an interview with Simon back in the 70s, I believe, and so what we included in this book is an edited version of that interview. And in this section also is another interview by Susan, and she interviewed Simon, and it covers a time period, I believe, like in the 90s up to the present, and his time of being a professor in Canada, and then his work in the 2000s. And the third interview is one that I did with him, and as Simon said, we more or less picked up from the interview that we had left off with back in the late 70s. And that one is quite an extensive interview, and it provides, I guess, Simon goes back all the way to his childhood up to about the late 80s, and it's quite comprehensive. So that's section 2. Section 3 of the book is the creative pieces by Native women writers, and each one of these writers talks about how Simon has been an influence in their life. And these writers include well-known writers such as Leslie Marmon Silko, Joy Harjo, Laura Tohi, and there's quite a few other writers from across the country who worked with Simon at some point and were influenced by him. And finally, the last section of the book is a collection of critical essays by scholars from across the country, from major universities. And they cover quite a diverse topic. Some focus on his poetry, some on his fiction, some focus on his nonfiction, I believe, his children's literature as well. So, as I said, it was very much an honor and a privilege to work on this collection. In the process of working on it, I ended up reading almost everything that Simon has written, his essays, his nonfiction, and his fiction. Although I did not read his children's literature because someone was focusing on that specifically. And as I did the research on him, and as I reread his essays and his work, I just, you know, at times I was just utterly amazed at the depth of his writing and at what I saw, the deep, you know, philosophical ideas that are inherent in his writing and the belief system that he's writing out of, which of course is coming from his Carries or Acoma Pueblo cultural, you know, beliefs, and they become then very much a part of his approach to Native literature, very much a part of his creative writing as well. And I was particularly amazed by the interview I had with him. At the very end of the interview, we turned to a discussion of, you know, various issues. As I mentioned in the book, the talk also turned to casinos and Indian game men. And of course, as you know, in this area, there are Indian casinos all over, to the north, to the south, to the west of us. And so he made some remarks in that area that just absolutely astounded me, especially now going back to them. The interview took place in 2005. So this is like 4 years later, 2009, that I reread the interview. And he was commenting on a recession. You know, he says, people are saying we are not going into a recession, but we are. Well, of course, back in 2005, people didn't believe we were going into a recession. And of course, what happened in late 2008? We went into that recession. So there were just gems like that throughout his writing, throughout the things he talked to me about that just, you know, blew me away. And so, you know, I'm very pleased and proud to be a part of this book that focuses on his work. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to read the short essay, the creative piece that I wrote about Simon, and how I first came to know him and the influence that he had on me. This is entitled The Stories He Lives By. Summer 1978. I was a young journalist in love with words, thriving on deadlines and adrenaline rushes, disbelieving that I actually got paid to meet and interview Indian leaders and newsmakers, the ordinary and extraordinary, the movers and shakers, like poet Simon Ortiz. Simon and I sat on the grass in the thick shade of cottonwood trees that dominated the then existing campus of the Albuquerque Indian School. The All Indian Pueblo Council was in the process of taking over the school from DIA control. The aging buildings were being condemned one by one, and AIPC was looking into how they could provide a better education for Pueblo youth. It was a fitting place for an interview with this poet. What with the political implications in a boarding school setting and Simon's confrontation of issues facing America and Native America in his writing. I was only vaguely aware of his writing, though by this point he already had 4 books to his name. His book, How About Indians, had just been published, his reputation growing. It was amazing to me that Indians could be authors. There had been none as I grew up, no characters I recognized in all the books I had read. I listened hard as Simon spoke, not only because that comes with journalistic training, but also because his words resonated within me. Quote, as Indian persons, each of us has different roles and tasks, and I decided I would write to carry out the responsibilities of teaching Indian and non-Indian people, end quote. Even if it had only started as an adolescent dream, I still harbored the thought that someday I could write a book. Oh, here's Greg. Greg, would you like to join us up here? I'm glad you made it. And here before me was an Indian author, a Pueblo no less, who wrote of people and places with which I was familiar, who showed in his poems and stories that our lives were as important and worthy as any. Like Coyote, he had been all over the country, working all kinds of jobs, meeting all kinds of people, and then writing about those experiences. His hands gestured as he spoke passionately about writing, about themes in his work, about responsibilities, about the value of language. The 60s were a defining moment for Simon. Quote, I think a lot of us went through quite a change. We came to a point in time when we had to make a decision either to keep on being treated as a stereotype image of the quiet Indian, or to speak out and to demand respect. Not just quietly ask, but to act, to confront the non-Indian power structure. I think this happened within the communities, Indian and non-Indian, and within ourselves. We gained a more firm idea of ourselves, what our human capabilities were and could become. He's continuing here. Most of my writing is part of a story of Indian people, life, land, America. Most Indian people grow up with the thought of being useful for the sake of the land, the people. This kind of philosophy is really what I want to make my writing be, he told me. It amazed me that an author was down to earth, a regular guy, not caught up in arrogance, but someone interested in community and in speaking to community. Looking back, I see so clearly that he, who had also been without Indian models, was making the way for all the Native writers who followed, including me. 8 years later, I was in a graduate program at the University of New Mexico in a creative writing program, studying Native American literature, not knowing then the Native American literary renaissance was beginning to roll, with Simon as one of the major writers at its forefront. Since then, I have become well familiar with Simon's work, and I've heard him read and speak many times, and I've had many conversations with him. Returning to this interview 26 years ago, I am struck with how Simon's message has remained constant over the years, as only a message that comes with conviction can. What he said then is what he always has said, and is what literary scholars have written about as a common theme of resistance in his work, and in Native literature in general. Quote, this is Simon speaking, Indian people are really energetic and enthused about how we can work, not only with organizations, just on specific levels, but throughout all themes. There is a lot of inspiration by looking at the long history of resistance. If our ancestors hadn't fought, we wouldn't be here. End quote. He told me in 1978 that in his writing, he strives for an in-depth insight into people, not just their personalities, but also into the events which surround people and in which they grow, sometimes even destructively. Quote, people's lives aren't always successful. I have always tried to find, even in defeat, inspiration for others. End quote. I think it is this quality in his writing of providing hope and inspiration that resounds with readers. He's an important writer, well regarded, revered even by some. He has contributed much to Native literature with his essays, poetry, and short stories, always with that seeming simplicity that overlays complexity. His native language, the stories of his people, his traditional upbringing permeate his thought, his writing, his voice, his presence. He speaks forth the Indian experience in a way people, white and Indian, urban and reservation, recognize and embrace. Always he opens with a reading in the Yakama language. His voice is resonant. He speaks slowly. His words are deceptively simple, but in their brutal honesty, they hit with a twang to the heart, like an arrow to the bullseye. He writes out of a tender compassion for the harsh political and social realities of Native life. He writes and speaks from the heart. In addition to his writing, his significant contribution to Native literatures is his constant support of emerging writers and support of the Native American Studies program at the University of New Mexico and the Creative Writing program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. I admire this community consciousness. No matter where he is, he always comes home to reconnect, to contribute, to participate. His writing, his life truly is for the land, the community, the next generation.
Simon and I go back quite a number of years. We actually were faculty together at the Institute of American Indian Arts, I think in the mid-70s, thereabouts. Not exactly sure about the years anymore because there have been so many. So it's just been just a couple of years ago. In any case, it's been long and I think very fruitful relationship and friendship, I think. In the context of working with Simon, I've certainly read many of his works, not all of them, but most of them. And, as Evelina is saying, I think particularly Simon has the genius to capture what Native people are thinking deep inside as they look out into the world and attempt to negotiate the various kinds of issues and situations that they have to negotiate within the context of Indian life, and sort of brings that forward in some very eloquent and beautiful and very profound ways, with a great deal of wisdom and also a great deal of compassion, I think, for the situation and also for what he happens to be writing about. Simon's been, I think, practically everywhere. he's been doing this work for many, many years. He teaches through his poetry, he teaches through his short stories, he teaches through simply his presence, in the context of the work that he's been doing all of these years. He's got an activist nature, as we all know, and that comes out both in his poetry and also the work that he's done. And many of you may or may not know that, Simon was here at the University of New Mexico in the late 70s, early 80s, working with the Native American Studies program and also working with a number of different kinds of issues and projects that were part of the situations of that time and that place. I don't know that things have changed that much. They may have evolved into be called something else, but I think we're still working with some of the same issues that Simon was working with when he was working here at the University of New Mexico. So I really appreciate, that kind of longevity in terms of the kind of work and also the creative genius that he brings to describing, narrating Native people negotiating a non-Native world primarily, but also the inner psychology that Native people feel, and he has this genius of being able to reflect that poetically in so many different kinds of ways that you have to read his poems like 3 or 4 times before you get, oh yeah, this is what that means, because there's many nuances. And that's, I think, the mark of a great poet, whose work speaks to you every time you pick it up, even though you've read that piece several times. You pick it up and you read it again and say, oh yes, that brings to mind something else.
I feel that that the work is very thorough and detailed in its analysis, and of course in the perspective personally and individually, but also I think in a much more objective, not objective entirely in the Western literary sense, but certainly in the way that indigenous or native people see themselves and see how others of the Native American world look at themselves and understand the life as it is. I just had a birthday 2 days ago. Bill reminded me. Of course, I didn't have to be reminded, but you know, I am well along, should I say? You know, and I was at a meeting at Acoma over the past 2 days, yesterday and the day before, because I'm on the board of trustees of the Ha'aku Museum, the Acoma Museum that's up there. You should go up there and visit. You know, it's a great little museum, and of course, it is representative of Ha'aku culture and the people of that part of the world. And anyway, I announced that I was 68 years old, and everybody said happy birthday. So, well, the members anyway that were there. Well, I'll say a few things about just about literature and about the book. I remember, yes, back when Evelina was a journalist for the 19 Pueblo, what's it called, Community News. I forgot exactly what the specific name. It was a newspaper that was published on behalf of the 19 Pueblo, All Indian Pueblo Council, back in those years when the old Indian hospital used to be there. And I remember there was an office there, and the old Indian hospital was where I was born in 1941, and at that time the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Health Service used to urge women to come to the hospital, to go to the community nurse, who was always white, and they would then be transported to, or you went on your own to the area hospital, and that was the Albuquerque area hospital. And I think in Santa Fe for the northern Pueblos there was a hospital there, but for the southern Pueblos, which included Acoma, which is west of here, the women who were on the verge of giving birth were taken there, and then children were born there. And so I was born in that hospital, and so I don't think I included that in part of my interview with Evelina, but if you ever revise it, you can include that fact. But I remember that because she was younger, and of course I was younger, and my children, who are both grown, Raho, who is 40 years old, who's a lawyer, I remember him, and his little sister Rainey, and some of you know Rainey. She was maybe 4 or 5, and they would go off to the playground and you know, whatever, riding the teeter-totter or playing the sand or something. And they were there too, you know, usually out in the yard of the Indian school grounds, where I also went to school there for, let's see, part of my 8th grade year and my 8th grade year and the part of my 9th grade year. I remember I went to St. Catherine's before that, and then Albuquerque Indian School, and then finally back home to live at home and go to Grants High School, which is near the Acoma Reservation, from which I graduated in 1960. Well, that's only part, of course, my history, but you know, most of what I write about is based upon personal experience. Personal experience insofar as I am concerned as an individual or personal being. But you know, I think as a indigenous writer of the Americas, you know, I'm not just writing about myself or focused through me, because I find more and more that my views and my outlook has to do with really writing from a sense of community. And I think that means that then the issues, that the topics and the concerns that I focus upon is very much directed to the source of that voice, meaning that I look at the community and that I channel things through the community. Because I think for Native American people, Indigenous American people who are writing today right from the source of the oral tradition, and the oral traditional is very much a function of the community. The voice of the oral tradition is the voice of community. And I think that if anything, people, I think, should be concerned about and should perhaps consider as a frame of reference when you look at Native literature, Indigenous literature, that it's really the voice of community that is really the focus. You are seeing through the writer and into the writer at the same time that you are looking into the community, into land, culture, and community, which is kind of a mantra that in the past 10, 15 years that I've repeated, land, culture, and community, because that is the life on which and through which and to what the people are related, the land, their community, and their culture. My own, I think, vision as a person is as a Acoma person, meaning that my identity as a writer, as Simon Ortiz, or in my Acoma name, Hitrutsi, is always to be understood, I believe, in terms of that community. I am no other person except as a Acoma citizen, as a member of that Hanmi or community called Anko. And I think that if there's anything that's critically relevant to Native American people as a expresser of what life is in the Americas, that's what that voice is, that it's speaking about land, culture, and community of the Americas as a whole. And so this book that was put together, edited by Evelina and Susan, is really a look at me, but I would want that book to be understood also as a look at the Americas through indigenous sensitivity, or through indigenous eyes, because it is certainly a voice that I have, expressed. I think that sometimes it is a self-conscious struggle to talk about yourself, but that's what artists actually do. It's even if they're writing about something else, someone else, or history, or something that's objective. Obviously you're using elements or ingredients or tools that at your hand, and which are part of your intelligence or intellect, as well as your human sensory mechanisms. So it's really through you that your understanding comes, when you express yourself as an indigenous writer. At least for me, that's the way it works. I think that about 2 weeks ago, last week I guess, I was at a conference in Minneapolis, and it was the Native American and Indigenous Studies Conference in the University of Minnesota. And one of the persons that was attending there, who's an old friend and who's a critic sometimes that has been countered, or perhaps people have found some difference with. He was standing. He came up to me as I was at the University of New Mexico Press's book table, And he said, so I had the book, you know, Simon J. Ortiz, a legacy of poetic continuance in my hand. And he said, this man, Professor Arnold Krupat, who's a good friend, but whose views sometimes are critically looked at. Well, anyway, he said, what does it feel like to have a book written on you? And I looked at him and I said, well, I'm a little self-conscious about it. And so that's really an honest reaction that I have. Well, I am thankful, though. I am appreciative. You know, some people have said that you don't take compliments easy. Well, some of it is complimentary, and some, I guess, I could feel that they're a bit. Well, I won't say that they're negatively critical, but I think that necessarily people see things the way they want to see them, and it's important. One of the things about Indigenous writing today is there's not enough of a critical look at the works that we do as creative and intellectual people. It's necessary for any culture, any society, to have examination made of what they express. If they don't, then you know, we're likely to do and feel free to go any direction that we want. You know, I always feel, and especially for indigenous cultures and societies, that we must be responsible for what we do have. You know, so that our lives are intact and are in balance and are productive in a positive way. You know, and unless you are also then open, you know, to other perspectives, you know, and even perhaps even incisively negative or at least critical look, then we may be going the wrong way inadvertently, or perhaps even at our fault. And so I would hope that, and I've said this among colleagues, you know, other indigenous scholars and academics, you know, that we need to really go ahead and look closely at ourselves. So when you read this book and read what I write, you know, hopefully you see yourselves in it. In fact, once I wrote just up the street a poem about this man falling down across the street. I was at that time, Greg mentioned me being an activist some time back, and still in a sense now to a degree. But I saw this man, a Native American man, fall down in the street, and then I saw him out the window of this office I had on Central, and I went out the door and I helped him to his feet. And I helped him come across the street to our office and gave him some coffee and had him rest, sit down for a while. Well, I wrote a poem about the experience, you know, and I realized that what I wrote about myself and about him in that moment was a poem that asked for people to look really into themselves by saying, you know, that what I wrote is a look into me, in order that you may see yourself. And that's what a poet or a fiction writer does, or I do creative nonfiction as well, does. And I think that if any artist does her or his work in the best way, it is work that has people seeing themselves through their work that she or he does. I was asked to sing a song, a birthday song Bill mentioned, since Bill Collins is an old friend who teaches at Highland High School. He was also a teacher of my daughter, who's a wonderful writer. Some of you may know her work. Sarah Ortiz, who's a graduate of IAIA, and who will soon graduate with an MFA in creative writing from Antioch University in LA. And soon she will be published. She has been published, but not a book of her own yet. So anyway, Bill and Evelina have both been teachers of Sarah Ortiz. And as I say, I call them veterans of Sarah Ortiz. And then a Welshman who says, "Can you sing that Beauty Roan Horse song?" Well, okay. I'll sing one verse. I don't sing it too often anymore. I used to sing it very often, but I don't much. There's a friend of mine who was a jazz musician, Jim Pepper, who always used to say, "Why don't you let me put music, the jazz saxophone behind that, or other songs?" We never got a chance to do it before he passed away. So I'll sing this for Bill and for Jim Pepper, who was born in the same year that I was, and he died as a much younger than me. This song really came about once I was teaching summer school at what I call Navajo Community College, NCC, but it's changed its name, just like IAIA changed its name. I still call it NCC, and I still call it IAIA, even though its name is now College of Native Contemporary Art, right? Oh, Contemporary Native Art. I stand corrected. Beauty Roan Horse, Beauty Roan Horse. Somebody said it to me, and I misheard. It was Beauty Roan Horse, Beauty. But I heard it as Beauty. It sounded much better as Beauty. Beauty Roan Horse, Beauty Roan Horse. Beauty Roan Horse, Beauty Roan Horse. Beauty Roan Horse, Beauty Roan Horse. Beauty Roan Horse. Beauty roan horse, beauty roan horse, beauty roan horse. I know that life is hard, I know that life is hard. Beauty roan horse, beauty roan horse, beauty roan horse, beauty roan horse. Beauty roan horse, beauty roan horse, beauty roan horse, beauty roan horse. I know that life is good, I know that life is good. Beauty roan horse, beauty roan horse, beauty roan horse, beauty roan horse. Beauty roan horse, beauty roan horse, beauty roan horse, beauty roan horse is home.
When you are in the creative state and composing, are you composing in your native language or are you composing in English?
Do I compose in the native language or in English? I think that creative dynamics is not necessarily in any specific language. I think that there is a power within the, whatever, say the state of the imaginary, that function of the brain where even language is not present. Language in its linguistic distinctiveness, you know, but rather there's an impulse of maybe the soul or the spirit or some kind of force that has has that ability or has that function of bringing about, say, awareness of oneself. You know, we see ourselves within an environment, and how we respond to that environment is going to be determined by, yes, the language that we know, but I think even behind that language, there's some other, I don't know, maybe structures that are without conscious identification as Acoma or English or Spanish or French or Martian or whatever term might be applicable. You know, so no, I have to say that yes, while it's easy to say yes, I think in English or I think in Acoma, I think that there is some other if not linguistic, but some other, say, spiritual or sacred awareness that is there at that a writer or a creative person is aware of. I think we are all aware of that. You know, how do children learn within their own language? Yes, that's what we do. But I think even though that may be convenient to say, I think that there is something that, some other force that is beyond that Acoma language, that original language that the first language that I was aware of was in the Acoma language, and then of course other languages such as English.
Simon, what's your favorite book?
My favorite book? They're all my favorite books. Well, I am. I don't have a real favorite book. I mean, I think I like, or I'm partial, you know, to some books like From Sand Creek is really a long poem. It's a long book-length poem, you know, and so I tend to say that the longer poems, you know, I like. I've been doing long poems, like 15, 20-page poems. None of them are, except for one, I think the last poem in Out There Somewhere is a long poem. I think it's about 10, 11 pages or so. But the longer poems, like the 15, 20-page ones, you know, really haven't been published all that much. There's one that's coming out in a Canadian journal soon. So I tend to like longer poems now. So that's why I think that From Sand Creek, because it's a book-length poem.
I teach New Mexico history, and I do this section on changing consciousness after World War II, and of all the writers and artists, because you have to like rush it at that part. And I read from your poetry to my class, and I would tell them about you. And I read from an early book of poetry in Hunger in New York City, I think one of your poems.
Yeah.
And then I read from the Sand Creek poem about what happened to all the hardworking, humble people as they went west.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they shouldn't have stopped and listened to Cotton Mather and stopped and listened to this, and they should have listened to us about the whole Buffalo. And, so I read this to my classes, along with Lucy Tapahanzo.
Well, thank you. I hope that you offer also a historical reference, you know, because if any book definitely looks at history as structure, a history of maybe a social organization, and especially where history has become part of the mores, social mores. If From Sand Creek, you know, obviously is. Obviously also, you know, From Sand Creek is a real look at the violent history of the Americas. Because when I wrote that, it was still during, when I first drafted that book, it was still the early 1970s, still during the Vietnam War, the U.S. invasion of Vietnam, Southeast Asia. And today people still use that book as a literary text and also with reference to history, you know, because of what's taking place in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so it has usefulness to it. You know. Well, thank you.
Your grandfather, so you must be the storyteller of the family, apart from your published work. But are you going to put out more children's books?
Barbara says that I'm grandfather 8 times. You know, so that obviously makes me qualified of some sort. Well, I have written 4 children's books, you know, and the book Simon Ortiz, A Legacy of Poetic Continuance, actually has a chapter on children's book. I was really glad that Debbie Reese was included because she's quite a scholar, you know, and she would be a valuable addition, asset to any university. She wants to move back out west to west as in New Mexico, which is home for her, or Arizona, and so I hope UNM administration is listening. They want a good scholar as part of their department, you know, in children's literature. And anyway, she writes about my children's books. Yes, I would like to do more children's, children's books. It's a very important, I think, direction that literature needs to take, you know, because children are the beginnings of human life, you know, and obviously children in the United States, with its growth rate and needs more positive reinforcement, encouragement of the young, of the youth. You will see more children's works. Not just because I'm a grandfather, but because I think people should make a place for children's works. And I want to thank Mr. Joe Sando from Jemez Pueblo, who came especially for today's event. Mr. Sando has been an elder and an example of intellectual expression for many years as a historian of the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. And he has resigned for the most part, but he has been such a busy man most of his life, or all of his life, that he continues to be a role model and to help others, you know, fill the need for the Indigenous American voice to be heard. So thank you, Mr. Sando, for being here.